There's a fellow here called Morton Klein. He's national president of the Zionist Organization of America, the oldest pro-Israel group in the United States, founded in 1897. No, he hasn't been president for the whole time. He's widely regarded as one of the leading Jewish activists in the United States. He's a child of Holocaust survivors, and he was actually born in a displaced persons camp in Günzburg, Germany. The National Jewish Weekly, The Forward, named him one of the top 5 Jewish leaders in the US today, stating, quote, "It's impossible to deny that Klein has been extraordinarily effective," end quote. I don't think they were happy having to say that, knowing The Forward. In his early career, he was a mathematician, and he worked closely with 2-time Nobel laureate Linus Pauling. He's been a lecturer in mathematics and statistics at Temple University. The Jerusalem Post is called the ZOA, one of the most important and influential groups in the United States today. The Wall Street Journal called the ZOA heroic and the most credible advocate for Israel on the American Jewish scene today. And we would also, the journalist said, quote, "snap a salute to those who were right about Oslo and Arafat all along, including Morton Klein, who was wise, brave, and unflinchingly honest, as you will hear today." The New York Times The New York Times, in a profile called Public Lives, called Klein a man who ferrets out anti-Semitism wherever it is, a rare voice from the outset in the American Jewish community against the Oslo Accords, and an iconoclast who is a prolific speech maker, writer, and progressional lobbyist. I'm not finished. His successful campaigns against anti-Israel bias in leading textbooks, travel guides, university, churches, and the media, as well as his work on Capitol Hill, were the subject of 30 feature stories, both here and in Israel. I'll relate on that in a moment. This man, as a private citizen, traveled to Germany and persuaded the publishers of Baedeker's, the world's leading travel guide, to correct the many anti-Israel errors in its guide to Israel and Jerusalem. As a private citizen, had nothing to do with ZOA at the time. They asked him, who should we get to correct it? He said, I'll correct it. Other campaigns by Klein dramatically reduced the number of anti-Israel lecturers at Villanova University. He lives in Philadelphia, and the largest church in the Philadelphia area. So, travel guides. One person went over as a private citizen, Morton Klein. Textbook lies, the biggest textbook publisher in this country. He called out the lies about Israel in one major school district. He got them to listen. He got them to get in touch with the textbook publishers. The publishers agreed to meet with Klein. This is amazing. Private citizen. There was a law passed by Congress in 1995. You may have heard of it. It was a law to move the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv, where it had no business being, to Jerusalem. Who do you think initiated the work on getting that law passed? Morton Klein. And it's amazing, in all of these efforts, He went to major Jewish organizations before to join him. After all, the whole group together would have more of an impact. Nope. In fact, they tried to talk him out of these efforts. And it wasn't until this law looked like it was finally going to get passed that major Jewish organization joined Morton Klein. At that time, he was president of ZUA. And so the embassy was supposed to be moved. But a couple of Jewish lawmakers put on a proviso that gave any president of the United States the ability to hold off on this move, and every 6 months they had to declare it if there was a security issue. And of course, every single president since 1995, every 6 months has put it off. Need I tell you who didn't put it off? Actually, he put it off first, but then 6 months later, we moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Morton Klein did this. And finally, Title VI in the Education Department now is protecting Jewish students by name, those who are perceived as Jewish. What the hell does that mean? Perceived as Jewish. I guess it's got to pay us an account, whatever. They are protected in educational locations from discrimination. Morton Klein did this. He is an incredible worker. He cares about Israel and the Jewish people like nobody else. And he does all this in spite of a speech problem called Tourette's, which he will mention to you. In spite of all of that, nothing holds back Morton Klein. I'm getting verklempt. Would you please stand and applaud for this man? Please. You have to come up now.
Well, thank you so much for that highly exaggerated introduction. But I'm glad that you read it exactly the way I wrote it for you. Everything is anticlimactic now. I can't live up to that. Yes, I have Tourette syndrome. I make sounds I can't control. And I have facial tics I can't control. There it is. I have it since age 5. And I frequently say it's one of the reasons the very first woman who showed any interest in me, I married her immediately. I didn't want to be alone. No, I did have relationships with women who broke up with me. They said they couldn't stand the tics and the sounds. And I said, I can't stand them either, but I can't do anything about it. Well, I mean, look, ZOA fights for Israel through our, as was mentioned, through our Center for Law and Justice. We changed Title VI. Title VI only used to cover blacks and Hispanics, never covered Jews. We launched a 6-year campaign. It took us 6 years. I enlisted 40 different congressmen. We wrote articles. We lobbied. We begged other organizations to join us. And I have to tell you, Abe Foxman says to me more, you don't change things by lawsuits. You change it by diplomacy, which is ridiculous. We changed the civil rights for blacks, the appropriate civil rights for blacks through the legislation and through laws, not through diplomacy. So all the lawsuits you see now under Title VI to try to protect Jewish students from discrimination and harassment, is due to the efforts of ZOA. We're on campuses as well. And I'm going to do this. This is a picture of the Middle East. That yellow, and actually Israel is smaller than that because that includes Judea and Samaria and Gaza, which no longer, parts of it are not longer part of Israel. That's the tiny country we're fighting for. The Arab world of 22 countries, the orange, it doesn't include Iran. They're not an Arab country. They're Muslim, Persian. 700 times the size of Israel. 700 times Israel. And yet the world is saying, land for peace. Land for peace. And who they asked to give the land up? It's the state of Israel. One of the things we're fighting for on Capitol Hill, in agreement with 85% of the Israelis, is to not permit the establishment of a Palestinian Arab terrorist state on Israel's longest border. But during these difficult times, I thought I would start off with something somewhat positive, maybe comforting and uplifting, to remember America has had a love affair with the idea of reestablishing a Jewish state of Israel since America's beginnings 250 years ago. Abraham Lincoln, many times in his speeches, would say, quote, "Reestablishing Israel is a noble dream shared by many Americans." Abe Lincoln. President John Adams said, "I wish the Jews would reestablish Judea and Samaria as an independent Jewish nation." John Adams didn't call it the West Bank. He called it by its true name, Judea and Samaria. Teddy Roosevelt, in speeches, would say, "It seems to me entirely proper that we must start a Zionist state around Jerusalem." He understood Jerusalem is uniquely holy to the Jewish people, not anyone else, especially not the Muslims. I'll talk about that. Woodrow Wilson in 1917 endorsed the Balfour Declaration, saying, "I'm proud to be able to help restore the Holy Land to its people, the Jewish people." Woodrow Wilson. In the early 1800s, the top Presbyterian pastor in the country, John MacDonald, the top Mormon, Elder Orson Hyde, talked about the prophecies of Isaiah. MacDonald predicted America would be the one who assists the Jews to ensure they restore their ancient state of the Jewish people. Hyde said, "The great wheel is unquestionably in motion, and the words of the Almighty has declared it will roll." These are the top religious leaders in the 1800s. The leading American news and opinion paper in the first half of the 19th century was the Niles Weekly Register. It predicted and welcomed regularly in editorials the impending return of the Jews to an independent state, with Jerusalem as its capital. And they said it would be good for the U.S. as well as for the Jews. Books and pamphlets highlighting the predicted restoration of the Jews in their homeland were perennial bestsellers in the 1800s. The relationship between the country's leading evangelist, Dwight Moody, and the major Bible scholar, Cyrus Scofield, put the future history of Israel in the center of the imagination of conservative American Protestantism. In 1891, the major Methodist lay leader, William Blackstone, presented a petition to President Benjamin Harrison, calling on the U.S. to urge the Ottoman Empire to turn Palestine over to the Jews. And remember, Palestine was a region. Palestine was not a country. Palestine has never been a country. There are no Palestinian kings and queens. It was a region. William Blackstone got 400 signatories, 1891, overwhelmingly not Jewish. This was before AIPAC, before ZOA, before AJ Committee, before any Jewish organization. He got the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to sign, the Speaker of the House, the chairs of House Ways and Means Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, future President William McKinley, the mayors of Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, editors of the leading newspapers in the U.S., the leading Episcopal, Methodist, and Roman Catholic clergy, business leaders like Cyrus McCormick, John Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. They all signed this urging in 1891 before Jews had any influence in America to reestablish the Jewish state of America. This is who the American people are. This is who they are. And we should know that and take pride and comfort in that. Instruction in biblical Hebrew was mandatory in early U.S. history at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, and Dartmouth. Over 1,000 cities and towns in the U.S. have names from the Bible, from the Old Testament, from the Torah in this country. And here's something rather extraordinary. I'm sure few, if any of you know. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams fought against establishing the Great Seal of the United States, which is an eagle, the seal we have right now. They lobbied and fought very hard to have the Great Seal be Moses standing on the shore, extending his hand over the sea, causing the sea to overwhelm Pharaoh and his military, with rays from a pillar of fire above in the clouds reaching down to Moses to express that Moses was acting by the command of God as the children of Israel looked on. This is the seal that Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams pushed hard to make the official seal. Three of the leading founders of this country. There was a vote. It barely lost. It barely lost. Moses, the Hebrew, splitting the sea to destroy the Egyptian army, almost became the seal of the United States of America. And we Jews should know this type of history. And in 1948, when the U.S. was discussing supporting Israel's reestablishment in the UN, the White House Chief Counsel Clark Clifford would lobby Truman regularly. We got to support the state of Israel, saying it comports with American traditional values. And he would always, in his speeches and his meetings with Truman, quote from Deuteronomy, from the Torah, quote, "Behold, I have set the land before you." That's Hashem speaking, God speaking. "Behold, I have set the land before you." Clifford would quote from Deuteronomy. "Go in and possess the land, which the Lord swore unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give it to them, and to their seed after them," unquote. That's in the Torah, that God gave this land to us from the Bible, with the pressure from Clifford and others. And the polls in 1948 showing Americans supported the reestablishment of Israel by 3-1 in 1948. He made the historic decision to vote in the UN to recognize the state of Israel in 1948. Thank God for that. Thank God for the American people who were huge supporters of us before we had a lobby, before Jews were influential or important in this country. And today, what we're going through, what we see today, the pain, we shouldn't be totally shocked. As we read in our Passover Haggadah every year, the Haggadah painfully predicts, quote, "In each and every generation, they rise up against the Jews to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be He, God Almighty, rescues us from their hands." From slavery in Egypt, to the Roman massacres, to renaming our homeland, Judea and Samaria, Philistia, again for our enemies, to blaming the Jews for the Black Plague, falsely claiming the Jews murdered Christian children, the genocide attempted by Haman, to the Greeks outlawing Judaism, being expelled from France, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Spain, and Portugal, to the Holocaust, to today's Arab Muslim army of 30,000 terrorists. We Jews have experienced repeated attempts to harm and destroy us. We don't understand why, but the Haggadah has predicted this. So we shouldn't be so shocked that we're enduring this, but we always should know, ultimately, Hashem will prevail in protecting us, and we will succeed in survival. And we should also know the Hamas horror of October 7th, where the Arabs didn't start with October 7th. The Arabs, the innocent Gaza Arabs, overwhelmingly elected Hamas to be their leader. 80% voted for Hamas. These so-called innocent civilians. Israel has experienced 30,000 rockets since 2005. It didn't start with October 7th. The fact that so few Jews were killed from 30,000 rockets is a miracle. There's very few empty spaces in Israel. I believe this is a miracle from God. Nothing else can really explain this, that Hashem, in those instances with these rockets, were protecting us. October 7th was an invasion of 3,500 trained Hamas terrorist army, funded and armed by Iran. And let me tell you about Iran. This administration, when they took over, Iran was on the verge of bankruptcy. It had $4 billion in reserves in their accounts. This administration gave access to Iran of $26 billion. This administration ignored the sanctions that the previous administration instituted to make it impossible for Iran to sell oil or do very business. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. This administration has been ignoring those sanctions, and Iran has now gone from $4 billion in reserves to $100 billion in reserves. enabling them to fund Hamas and Hezbollah Islamic Jihad. We have to understand this. What I'm saying is not a political statement. It's a statement of fact that has allowed this horror to have occurred and to continue to occur. And they not only murdered, raped, and tortured 1,200 innocent Jews. These attacks have made Israel even tinier. Tiny Israel is tinier. Why do I say that? Because Jews cannot live in southern Israel right now because of Hamas rockets. Jews cannot live in northern Israel now because of Hezbollah rockets. Over 100,000 Jews, innocent Jews, which is not written about, not talked about. Many of you may not even realize it. They have left their homes. They live in hotels, in other people's houses, in tents. They've been displaced. They're living miserable, disrupted lives. And nobody talks about these people. And that's what's happening now in Israel. That's why it's so important for Israel to destroy Hamas and to destroy Hezbollah. This is something that has to be done, or we will not have northern and southern Israel anymore. And all I hear is that we dare not displace the Arabs of Gaza who voted in Hamas. Hamas is as big an enemy of the U.S. as it is of Israel. This is a war that Israel is fighting not only for Israel, but for the U.S., for Europe, and the entire world. We are in this war against Islamic radical terrorism together, and we all, Jews and Americans, better understand that. Here's proof of that. Mahmoud al-Zahar, who was the co-founder of Hamas, 2 months ago put out a video. He put a podcast out. He said this, al-Zahar, I want all of you to know, first we're going to kill all the Jews. All the Jews, you're all dead. We're killing all of you. But we're not done with killing Jews. That's not enough. After we kill all the Jews, we're coming after the Christians. He says in his podcast, we're going to kill all the Christians. We're going to kill all the non-Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, all of you. And we will establish an Islamic caliphate. And the entire world will become Islamicized. This is 2 months ago. Did you read about it on the front page of the New York Times or the LA Times or anywhere? Did you hear Schumer condemning it? Did you hear Biden condemning it? This is the co-founder of Hamas telling us what their goal is. But instead, you have Schumer and others publicly condemning Netanyahu. You shouldn't be the prime minister. We need new elections. We're telling Israel they need new elections, you know, and should get rid of cabinet members that Schumer and others don't like. We say that. We don't say anything about Mahmoud Azhar and such things, despite the fact that the Hamas charter openly says in Article 7, kill every Jew. It's Article 7 right there in black and white. Article 13, to destroy Israel. And let me tell you, many of these policies, this administration, forgive me for having to say this, is on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the American public, the wrong side of the Israeli public, and the wrong side of where the facts should lead them. They're demanding now a 6-week ceasefire. Now, Israel, under enormous pressure, is going along with it. I know they really don't want this. They want a 6-week ceasefire, even a permanent ceasefire, in this war against Hamas. Ladies and gentlemen, there are no ceasefires in war. There's no ceasefires in war. Did we have a ceasefire in the Civil War? World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam? You fight until you destroy the enemy. You don't let them regroup and resupply. Israel is on the verge of victory, despite being handcuffed. They need to destroy the final large numbers of Hamas officials and their last battalions in Rafah. And Biden and Blinken, a few weeks ago, listen to this. Listen to what they said. This is their quote. Israel's priority should be protecting the Gaza Arab enemy civilians. They don't call them enemy civilians. Israel's priority should be protecting the Gaza Arab civilians. That's Israel's priority? That's what they said. No, Israel's priority is protecting its own civilians, its own soldiers, destroying Hamas, destroying Hezbollah, and freeing the hostages. That's their priority. That's what they have to do. Let me ask you, in World War II, was our priority to protect the German civilians? Was that our priority? 90% of whom supported the Nazis? They weren't innocent German civilians. They supported the Nazis. They voted them in, and they were thrilled with what they were doing. And Hamas tells us that there are 35,000 civilians have been killed. That's Hamas's words. It's funny, Hamas is a very reliable source, aren't they? And yet, this administrations around the world, all the newspapers, quote the Hamas numbers. I can assure you, if you're capable of murdering, raping, torturing, and mutilating Jews, mutilating people, and do it with glee, you are capable of lying about the number of civilians that were killed. And every civilian killed was caused by Hamas, who started the war and violated international law, hiding illegally behind civilians. So Hamas says there are 35 civilians that have been killed, 1,000 civilians. They ignore the fact that we know for sure 15,000 have been Hamas active terrorists. Furthermore, with respect to the rest, a respected Morton professor and other analysts and statisticians have analyzed the data. They say it is phony data, inconsistent, exaggerated, it makes no sense. For example, every day Hamas cites the same number of people, civilians who were killed. The same number every day. That's pretty remarkable. That sounds legitimate, doesn't it? It's impossible. These numbers by Hamas are false, and we have Biden and the media and others quoting these numbers as if they're legitimate. They're illegitimate. And the world is so worried. The whole world, it's not just this administration, the whole world is so worried about Arab civilians in Gaza. Well, when we Americans went to war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, we killed 400,000 civilians. Nobody said a word. The Saudi Arabia-Yemen war, 150,000 civilians were killed. Nobody said a word. The Iraq-Iran war, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. 600,000 civilians were killed by Syria, their own people, 600,000. And what about the million Chinese Muslims in concentration camps? Silence. Not a word about these innocent civilians. And nobody was demanding a ceasefire in these wars. And for God's sakes, 52,000 innocent African black Christians, civilians, have been murdered and massacred by African black Muslims in the last decade, and no one says a word about this tragedy, this horror. They're only worried about Gaza civilians who support Hamas and are thrilled to have Jews being murdered. And really, why are they attacking and condemning these civilians being killed? It's a way to attack the Jewish state for so many of the people without being called anti-Semites. This double standard of attacking Israel for civilian deaths, but attacking no one else for civilian deaths, has a name for it. It's called anti-Semitism. That's what this is. It is purely anti-Semitism. John Spencer, a great military academician at West Point, and Colonel Kemp from England have written articles saying that the ratio of the amount of civilians killed, that Israel has killed compared to Hamas terrorists, is less than 1 to 1. It is the lowest ratio of civilians to soldiers killed in the history of warfare. Israel is a human rights beacon, extraordinary, and deserves credit for risking their own soldiers' lives. And I don't agree that they do that, but they do it in order to protect civilians. And instead, we are condemned, Israel's condemned, for killing too many civilians, and we can't take it anymore. Linda Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, just made a whole speech attacking Israel. We can't tolerate all these civilians being killed. And these Arab civilians, are they so innocent? As I said, they overwhelmingly elected Hamas. They were in the streets by the thousands, cheering, handing out sweets when the Arabs brought dead, innocent Jewish bodies into Gaza on trucks that they murdered. You have thousands of Arabs cheering, spitting on the Jewish bodies, beating on the Jewish bodies. They're not innocent civilians, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, their own polls show that 95% support October 7th. These innocent Gaza civilians, 95% supported October 7th. And by the way, these polls include the Palestinian Arabs under Abbas. They're in that poll. 93% of the Palestinians say Hamas committed no crime on October 7th. That was not a crime. That was resistance. And almost all of them support Hamas, as I mentioned, on October 7th. Let me tell you something. I feel the same way about these Gaza Arabs as I feel about the German civilians of World War II who supported the Nazis. I don't give a damn about these people who want to kill Jews and are thrilled about Jews being killed. They can all go straight to hell as far as I'm concerned. And what about the humanitarian aid that this administration and countries around the world are screaming that we're not getting humanitarian aid, Israel is blocking it? Almost all the aid that goes into Gaza is stolen by Hamas. Israel allows hundreds of trucks in. It's Hamas that steals the aid, sells it on the black market for a huge profit. But in what war are you aware that you're aware of do you spend time and resources protecting enemy civilians? Who protects enemy civilians in a war? You want to crush your enemy that wants to kill you. And yet the whole world is screaming about Israel's got to protecting enemy civilians. It's unheard of. And especially when it's these civilians who fervently want to murder you and support murdering you. Civilian deaths is an unfortunate, unavoidable horror of every war. That's just the nature of war. And by the way, you read about the famine. The Gaza Arabs are suffering from famine. They're all starving to death. Only last week, a group aligned with the United Nations have finally put out a report. You don't read about this much in the papers, that there's no famine. It's a mistake. There's no famine. Things are not good, but there's no famine. And yet you keep reading about famine in paper after paper, article after article. It's completely false. And Biden and Blinken and the world and the UN is now screaming for a Palestinian state. We gotta have a Palestinian state. That will bring peace, they say. First of all, the Israelis see we have a small state. We give it to Arabs in Gaza. That was a small state. And what do we get with this small state? 35,000 rockets and this massacre and promises of more massacre. By the way, the Mossad in Israel said they have information that Hamas is planning another attack within the next 30 days, God forbid. This is what you give when you give them more power and more resources. 85% of Israelis are opposed to giving an even larger state with more land and more power and more ability to do greater damage to the Palestinian Arabs. Remember, Syria, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, and Libya, they have sovereign states. Are they lovely and peace-loving? Giving a statehood to terrorists with a horrific philosophy and belief system only gives them more power to promote their evil agenda. And also, don't forget, in the last 20 years, Israel has offered a state 4 times to the Arabs. 4 times in the last 20 years, and they turn it down every single time. Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, I talked to after he got out from prison, he offered the Palestinian Arabs a number of years ago 97% of Judea and Samaria, 3% of Israel proper to make up for the 3%, and half of Jerusalem, millions of dollars in aid. He offered them everything. There was no compromise. Everything. They turned it down. And I asked Olmert, how the heck did Abbas turn down? It wasn't even a compromise. You gave him everything you could give him. He said, Abbas said to me, I cannot do it unless you get rid of 3 clauses in the deal. One clause, I have to, is you say that I have to accept Israel as a Jewish state. I can never accept Israel as a Jewish state. You got to get rid of that clause. A second clause, you want me to limit the number of Arabs that come into Israel to 150,000. It was insane to even allow 150,000. He said, you can't limit it. I can bring in as many Arabs as I want into Israel. Otherwise, I can't sign it. And thirdly, he says, you got to get rid of the clause that says no further claims. And Omer, of course, said, but that's the deal. It's over. I'm giving you everything. We're giving you money. It's over. And Abbas said, I will not sign it. And by the way, not only have we offered him a state 4 times in the last 20 years, we've offered him a state 8 times in the last 80 years. 8 times. The first time was the Peel Commission in 1937, where they were offered 95% of the rest of Palestine. 80% of Palestine was already given to Jordan. It's a whole different story. So the rest of Palestine, they offered the Arabs 95% of it, the Jews 5%, and they said no. They won't accept a Jewish state, no matter how tiny it is. They won't do it. We have to understand the Arabs are not interested in the state. They're not even interested, frankly, in land. All they're interested in is killing Jews and Israel's destruction. And that's why nothing has ever worked, because the goal is Israel's destruction, and they won't make any other deal that may have Israel survive. So I talked to Secretary of State Blinken. How can you be offering a state to these Palestinian Arabs? They're a nightmare society. He said, no. They're going to reform. We'll offer it once they reform. I said, only a few weeks ago, they said they want to join with Hamas. And they bragged that hundreds of their own policemen were involved in the massacre of 10/7. I said, we're going to reform. There is a bigger nightmare as Hamas. And yet, there's this illusion that there can be some sort of reform. We're living in a fantasy. And I have to say, one of the problems is every major Jewish organization supports the state. Now, American Jewish Committee, Ted Deutsch wrote an article, we have to have a Palestinian state. ADL supports a Palestinian state. AIPAC on their website supports a Palestinian state. I might add, AIPAC also, when asked, what is your position on Jews living in Judea and Samaria? They say we take no position. They will not support it. AIPAC won't support Jews living, and we have 600,000 Jews living there. This is a problem. And when members of Congress and the administration sees this, why shouldn't they be supporting a state and being against Jews living in Judea and Samaria when we're not, when we're supporting the same thing? There's so many lies about what's going on in the Middle East. One of the big lies is about settlements. That Israel's building settlements everywhere, all over Judea and Samaria, making it impossible to ever have a state, if that would ever do anything. Let me tell you something about settlements. Since Oslo began in 1993, there's not a single new settlement that's been built. You hear what I said? Not a single new settlement has been built. There has been building. It's within the existing boundaries of the existing settlements, communities that were there in 93. They build within those communities. No new communities have been built since 1993, even though Oslo allows it. It's not against the Oslo agreements. So that's one of the big falsehoods. And another major falsehood is that end the occupation. There's a horrible occupation, and that's why we can't get to peace, because of the Israeli occupation of Arab land. Is there really an occupation? Occupation means you illegally stole sovereign Arab land. But this was never sovereign Arab land. In 1917, when the British set up the Balfour Declaration, they legally controlled the land. Then we had many international laws passed. The League of Nations Covenant, the British Mandate for Palestine, the UN Charter, Article 880, San Remo Resolution, the Lodge Fish Resolution. All these international laws held as a mandate for the Jews to have this as a state. It was never occupied land. It was never Arab land. There was never a country called Palestine. In fact, Palestine is a Roman name. If this was an Arab country, why would they use a Roman name to name it? And you know what else? The Arabs can't pronounce the letter P. They can't even say Palestine. They say Palestine. Would they name a state using a term, a word that they can't even pronounce? This is such a lie. There was never a country of Palestine. There was never an occupation. In fact, when Jordan controlled it after the 48 war, Judea and Samaria, between 48 to 67, only 2 countries recognized Jordan controlling it. And then when the Israelis captured it in the 67 war, they offered everything back except Jerusalem, and they said no peace, no negotiation, no recognition. Israel has given away 40% of Judea and Samaria, all of Gaza. That's where 99% of the Arabs live. There's no occupation. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas control 99% of their population. Israel doesn't. There's no occupation. The Palestinian Arabs have their own parliament, schools, textbooks, newspapers, radio and TV, businesses, and police force. They have complete sovereignty except security. Israel has to go into these areas because terrorist enclaves keep evolving to come into Israel to kill Jews. And so the Israeli IDF is in there finding these terrorists and destroying them. That's why we've had a reduction in major terrorist attacks in Israel. So this is one of the great lies, occupation. There is no occupation. and Jerusalem. This one I love. But I really blame Israeli leaders, Jewish leaders, for not making an issue out of this, not making this clear. Jerusalem, ladies and gentlemen, which the Arabs say is our holy capital of Jerusalem. Is Jerusalem holy to Muslims? It was the capital of Israel under King David 3,000 years ago. It's never been the capital of any nation except Israel. When the Arabs conquered Palestine in 716, they made Ramlah their capital, not Jerusalem. They call it the Temple Mount, not the Mosque Mount. This was our holy Jewish temple that was there. That's why it's called the Temple Mount. The majority of people living in Jerusalem since the mid-1800s, the first census, have been Jews. The majority of people living in Jerusalem since the mid-1800s have been Jews. In fact, I have you mentioned Bedeker's travel books. It's the oldest, most prestigious travel book company in the world. When I did the work for them, they gave me a guide to Jerusalem from 1906, which I have. In that guide, it said there were 60,000 people in Jerusalem at the time. 13,000 Christians, 7,000 Muslims, 40,000 Jews. It's always been Jewish. It's never been important to the Muslims. In fact, the Jewish holy books, we mention Jerusalem 700 times. How many times is it mentioned in the Quran? 0! That's right, never is it mentioned. How can it be such a holy city to them when their holy book is not even mentioned? No, I gave a speech just about Jerusalem in quite detail at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. And after I went through many, many aspects of this, which I'm not doing here, the rabbi got up and said, I'm very unhappy with Morton Klein telling the Muslims what's holy to them. If they say Jerusalem's holy to them, that's their decision. I don't want them telling me as a Jew what's holy to us. And I said, Rabbi, if tomorrow they say Los Angeles is holy to them, do I have to give them Bel Air and Brentwood? I mean, saying it doesn't mean anything. If they can prove that there's a truth to that, then we have to deal with it. So it's not enough that they say it, and it's a total lie. Look, we face Jerusalem, we pray, they face Mecca. And when they controlled it, from 48 to 67, the Arabs controlled Jerusalem. They make it a beautiful city. It was a slum, virtually no water, electricity, no plumbing. There were 58 synagogues there. They destroyed all 58 of them. No Arab leader, except from Jordan, ever visited Jerusalem when they controlled it. If it's so holy, why did the Arab leaders all go to Jerusalem and pray there and relish that they have control over it between 48 and 67? Because it's not holy to them. We have to start saying Jerusalem is not under discussion. I said to Rabin, Prime Minister Rabin, how could you put Jerusalem for discussion? He said, Lord, don't worry. It's on the table, but I'm telling you, we're not giving it to them. I said, no, once it's on the table, it means there's a legitimate basis for discussion. It never should have been put on the table. And why aren't our Jewish leaders, our rabbis, and our Israeli leaders screaming, Jerusalem is not holy to Muslims? It's not. If it was, we would deal with it. And that's really, and that's why Jerusalem should never, ever be discussed or even talked about to give any part of it to the Arabs. And Blinken says they're going to reform their society. Their textbooks are such a nightmare. In their textbooks to the students there, they have titles of chapters like Jews are evil, Jews are the Zionist enemy, Jews are fanatics, Jews kill Muslims and Christians, Jews are treacherous, Jews betray everyone, they're the enemies of the prophets, they foment wars, they're evil racists, on and on, condemning Jews. It's part of their curriculum. We have to denazify the curriculum in the Palestinian Authority. They have, on their TV, they have beautiful Arab girls like this and boys. What could be better than going to paradise? They promote suicide bombings on TV, in their speeches, in their articles. They promote it as a positive value. In fact, in the article, of all places, in the New York Times, one of the leaders of the New York Times, journalist, went to visit a family of suicide bombers. And he was shocked, he said, he wrote about this, that the bomber's mother said, I was so happy when I heard about my son's suicide bombing. To be a martyr, that's really something. Very few people can do it. I hope my other children do the same. This is their culture. It is a sick culture. And that's why nothing seems to work. Everyone should know about this. This is the official emblem of the Palestinian Authority. This is their emblem. It should be in all the Jewish papers. We should be displaying this everywhere. It shows all of Israel with an Arab keffiyeh over all of it. Not just not the Korea just over Judea and Samaria and Gaza and eastern Jerusalem, which they claimed initially. Arafat's picture, a Kalashnikov rifle. Is this the commission, the emblem you commission if you want peace with the Jewish state? This is who they are. They don't want peace no matter what. They want Israel destroyed. And when a suicide bomber kills a Jew or many Jews, they do a poster in every school, in every university, of the suicide bomber, honoring him, praising him. He becomes glorified, the suicide bombers. And right now, Palestinian Authority use $400 million a year to pay Arabs lifetime pensions of murdered Jews. Any Arab who murders a Jew gets a lifetime pension. If he dies killing a Jew, the family gets a lifetime pension. They spend $400 million a year. This is so heinous, it's beyond belief. And most Jews don't even know this. So we and others work to pass the Taylor Force Act. The Taylor Force Act, named after a West Point graduate, Taylor Force, who was killed in Tel Aviv by an Arab. He was a Christian. He had a beard. Maybe the Christian thought he was the Arab thought he was a Jew. And this legislation, signed in the previous administration, very simply says, we'll give you the $500 million we've been giving you. All we ask is that you stop the policy of paying Arabs to murder Jews. You stop that policy, you get your $500 million. Abbas said, we'll never stop that policy. These are our martyrs and our heroes. We'll never stop the policy. So the previous administration cut all aid. No more $500 million. This administration ignored the Taylor Force Act, not only reinstated the $500 million, increased it to $800 million. We now give the Palestinian Authority $800 million a year, despite the Taylor Force Act. And it's just horrifying. And what do you hear on campuses constantly? Israel's committing genocide. You see that on their signs. Genocide, genocide, genocide. What an incredible propaganda lie. And yet it's believed. You know, when I was growing up and I read about Jewish history, I read about that in the 1300s, 1400s, they were claiming Jews killed Christian children to get their blood to make matzah. Complete insanity. We're not even allowed to eat blood or drink blood. It's against the Jewish law. And they also were claiming that the Jews were poisoning the oil wells, and that's why you had the Black Plague. And I thought to myself, how could they ever believe this insanity during that era? Thank God we don't live in an era like that again. But look, they're believing that Israel's committing genocide when there's virtually no genocide. In fact, I was asked at Brown University, this is years ago, before this era, an Arab got up and said, Mr. Klein, why aren't you talking about the genocide Israel's committing against the Arabs? I said, it's interesting you asked that question. I said, in 1948, there were 150,000 Palestinian Arabs in this area of Israel. Today, there are 2 million Palestinian Arabs in this area of Israel. I said, whoever is in charge of the genocide program must be fired immediately. It's not working. It's not working. Do you know the next day, the Hillel, who invited me to speak, called me and said they wrote an article about my speech. And they said Morton Klein expressed chagrin that the genocide program wasn't working. Now, since I didn't go to Brown, I didn't know what chagrin meant, so it didn't bother me. And what about the insane lies? You hear it every day on television. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Well, Israel's fighting against Gaza. They're not fighting against the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria. Gaza has 2 million Arabs. No Jews, no IDF soldiers. It is a totally free area for Gaza Arabs. Since 2005, Gaza has been free, free, free. So it's insanity to say free Palestine. They're already free. We threw 10,000 Jews out of Gaza and removed our IDF officials. And they elected Hamas, of course, to run it, who only want to destroy the Jewish state. So this is complete insanity. But these are moral, irrational, bigoted monsters on campuses, half of whom are paid professionals and not even students there, paid for by George Soros, the Tides Foundation, and others. I talked to these people. They say they get $70 a day to demonstrate. And the organizers make 6 figures to organize these demonstrations. And they're screaming, we are Hamas, globalized intifada. What is globalized intifada? Kill all the Jews. They're saying kill all the Jews. F the Jews, and they're screaming. So what are they really screaming? They're really screaming, we're Nazis, we're the KKK, we're the brown shirts, we are rapists, we murder gays, we oppose all women's rights, we oppose all abortion, because that's what Hamas's beliefs are. Shame on these low-life morons. My recommendation, and it's not been followed except in a couple of cases, arrest all of these students and others, expel all of these students and others, bring in the National Guard. That's what we have to do. By the way, that's what they did in Florida. The governor of Florida made it clear to the presidents of the universities, we're bringing in, and by the way, he told me, I happen to know him, he told me that some of the presidents balked and said, we want diplomacy, let's talk to these people. And he said, look, this is I'm the governor, this is state land, I'm sending you got to accept the National Guard. And that ended any demonstrations in the Florida schools. The Jews in the world must understand that this Arab-Islamic war against the Jews in the U.S. is not about land or a Palestinian state. If it was, it would have been resolved in the 30s, when Britain offered virtually everything to the Arabs for a state. And the Arabs said no. They said no to a state in 1948, 2000, 2001, 2008, 2010, and when they could have established a state all of those years. This is a religious war against Israel and against Christianity, against the Hindus and Buddhists and the entire West. That's what this is. Al-Azhar University, which is the biggest, most important theological Islamic seminary on earth, it's in Cairo. On October 19th, you didn't read about this in the newspapers, the major, most prestigious, the West Point of the Islamic world, issued a dictum, an edict. It is legitimate to kill every Jew. Go and kill them. Can you imagine what I'm saying? This is a major university in Egypt, an Islamic university saying kill all the Jews. And I'm sure no one in this room even has ever heard of it, because it's not in any of the papers. That's what this culture, that's what this religion is about. In fact, even al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, who's not the greatest guy, but he made a speech a few years ago about Islam, and he said, this is the president of Egypt, is it possible that 2 billion people, Muslims, should want to kill the rest of the world's inhabitants? That's 7 billion people, it's impossible. We are in need, says Sisi, of a religious revolution. You imams are responsible before Allah. The entire world is waiting. It is inconceivable that thinking that we hold most sacred, what we hold most sacred should cause the entire Islamic nation to be a source of anxiety, danger, killing, and destruction for the rest of the world. It's impossible. We must have a revolution. Al-Sisi said it. He was bitterly attacked. He never said anything like that again. But even Sisi understood. This is a religious war. This is a war about the Quran, about Islam. It's not about land. It's not about statehood. One way to begin to minimize the Arab-Islamic war against Israel in the West is for countries in the U.S. stop funding these people, stop legitimizing them, stop whitewashing what they do, stop incentivizing them. We have to end all talk of handcuffing Israel's ability to destroy these Islamic terrorist groups run by Iran. There must be constant worldwide condemnation of Hamas, Abbas, Hezbollah, Iran, and others, and end any talk of rewarding them with statehood, money, and safety, which only gives them more power to promote their frightening caliphate agenda. They must denazify their cultures. It'll take years. Germany was denazified. It took many, many years, but it was denazified, and the place changed. We must change their textbooks, their sermons, their speeches, their TV. And we need Israel leaders, Jewish leaders, and rabbis to start promoting the truth of occupation, Jerusalem, Palestinian statehood, genocide, apartheid, and Abbas. That's what we have to start doing. We have to demand that President Biden stop praising the squad. He praises Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Yes, he praises them. Recently, he said of Rashida Tlaib, this monster from Michigan, he said, I'm quoting exactly to Rashida Tlaib, I admire your intellect, Rashida. I admire your passion. I admire your concern for so many other people. From my heart, I pray that your grandmom and his family are safe and well. I promise you, I'll do everything to see to it that they're well. You're a fighter, Rashida. God, thank you for being such a great fighter. This is what he said about Rashida Tlaib, this monster, instead of condemning. It's just, I'm just quoting real facts. These are the facts. So this inspires the Tlaibs and the Omars and Ayanna Presleys and Betty McClintocks and Jamal Bowman who lost. So I'll end by saying, In every generation, the Haggadah foresees that enemies will arise against us, but each time we overcome them. We've always emerged to rebuild and become stronger than before. Future years will be a time of regeneration, hope, new opportunities, and stronger communities. The Torah promises that Israel is the Jewish homeland, and that we will always be the Jewish homeland, and that the Jewish people are an eternal people. We're here forever. And unlike politicians, God keeps his promises. Thank you very, very much.
Please try and hang around for a bit more. I'm not turned on. We want to open up the floor to questions. You can understand now why it got verklempt over this man. He speaks truth, and he speaks it right to your face, and right to the face of our legislators, our representatives, and our leaders, in spite of the fact that so many large Jewish organizations don't support much of that. And that's a shanda. I want to remind you that about 7 or 8 years ago at Hebrew University in Jerusalem on Mount Scopus, where many Arab students are enrolled, there was one young woman who was writing her dissertation. And her dissertation was on the fact that the Israel Defense Forces were racist. Why were they racist? Anybody here ever heard this and understand why she called the IDF soldiers racist? Because they didn't rape the women who they conquered. Digest that for a minute. That's the culture, to rape the women that you conquer. And this woman wrote this dissertation that by not raping women that are conquered by the Israeli Defense Forces, they are racist. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I mean, look, the Arabs have views that are not to be understood, incomprehensible. They lie about everything. They just make things up, and they'll use anything to try and hurt Jews in Israel, even saying something as insane as that the fact that we refuse to rape Arab women, it shows that we are offended by them and we're disgusted by them. I mean, it boggles the mind, right? It's, as you said, it's a bizarre world. It's a bizarre world.
Let's just briefly.
But look, what mother praises her son dying by killing Jews and saying, "This is wonderful, I'm so proud of him"? That's their culture. So when Shimon Peres used to say, Arab mothers want the same for their children as Jewish mothers, it's not true. They have a different value system. And what country pays Arabs to murder Jews, pays people to murder other people? What country puts up posters of suicide bombers who murder Jews? Their value system is completely backwards, and it's not to be understood. That's why the only thing they'll understand is they see that they will not be successful. But if we keep funding them, praising them, saying we want to give you a state, that only encourages and emboldens them. We're not doing the right thing to try and end this nightmare, Arab-Islamic war against Israel and the West.
On college campuses, what we have seen, many people come up to me and there's discussion amongst ourselves. What the hell is going on here on college campuses? Where did this come from? We put an end to anti-Semitism. Well, of course we didn't. It went under the radar until people started talking outwardly the Tlaibs, the Presleys, all these people who brought anti-Semitism back into the mainstream, back into our conversation. But why the universities? What are they teaching in the universities? And we have to remember this whole concept of oppressor and oppressed, which is wildfire being taught on university campuses. There are people who are oppressed, which is the vast majority of BIPOC. Who knows what BIPOC is? BIPOC is Black, Indigenous people of color. BIPOC. They are the oppressed just by who they are. The oppressor, the white folks. When you have a mindset like that, you can call for the extermination of Jews, because Jews are pretty popular white folks. And they are the worst of the oppressors vis-a-vis what they lie about with respect to what's going on in Israel. So it's okay to kill them. It's okay to go into stores and steal. It's okay to beat up Jews on the streets of Brooklyn or St. Louis or in Jersey. That's what this is based on. Oppressor versus the oppressed. So it gives carte blanche to do whatever you damn well feel you want to do, because it's owed to you. You want to comment on this?
Look, one of the problems why this is continuing is that we do not have our leaders speaking out forcefully against the squad, or viciously anti-Semitic, anti-white. They're not being condemned, they're praised. As I just mentioned, one of the praiseworthy speeches given by our president. In fact, when I testified, I mentioned the other day, before the Judiciary Committee, which was at the time headed by Jerry Nadler, a Jewish man who I know very well, and I testified about the danger of Islam promoting hatred against Jews and others. My testimony, when I came to the part where I said that one of the problems is that the leaders of the party of Tlaib and Omar and McClintock and Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, who's a nightmare, is that the leaders don't condemn them. They have to be condemned. They have to be diminished and demonized. They are demons. But the party that has some control over them, are saying nothing. As soon as I said that, Jerry Nadler banged down his gavel and said, "Your time is up." Well, my time wasn't up. I said, "No, I have another minute." And he said, "I'm the chairman. I decide. Your time is up." He wouldn't let me continue. Then he called on Andy Gibbs from Arizona, a congressman, for his 5 minutes to speak. And Andy Gibbs, who I don't know, I know Nadler, I don't know Gibbs. Gibbs said, "I want to relinquish my 5 minutes of time to Mr. Klein to finish his testimony." That a guy I don't even know. So that's really one of the problems, is that our media and the leaders of the party of these anti-Semites, they're not condemning them and attacking them. In fact, they're made to feel comfortable. I was very thrilled when Kevin McCarthy finally threw Ilhan Omar off the Foreign Relations Committee. That's an important message. Of course, he was called an Islamophobe and a racist. Kevin McCarthy threw her out. These racists should be thrown out of every single committee, and then this type of nonsense would be diminished dramatically. We're not speaking out. Our Jewish leaders aren't speaking out, and even our rabbis, I think, have a role here, and they should be speaking about this. That's what's got to change.
Would you, is this on? Would you please comment about the term Islamophobia?
A phobia is where you have an irrational fear of something that makes no sense. Claustrophobia, you're afraid of looking out of a high window or something. There's no reason to fear that. Well, I frequently will say There's no such thing as Islamophobia. There is a rational basis to fear Islam and many of the radical Muslims. It's not a phobia, it's legitimate and it's rational. So that term should be thrown out the window. No one should even use it. What I really hate is when members of Congress and major officials will condemn anti-Semitism and in the same sentence condemn Islamophobia when there's virtually no hostility to Muslims in America. 60% of all the hate crimes are against Jews, not 15% are against Muslims. So that term should not be used. Why do they have to put Islamophobia in the same sentence as condemning anti-Semitism? And let me tell you, when this government passed a definition of anti-Semitism, they first said that we want to use the IRA definition, the International Holocaust or whatever. It's a good definition. And then with Deborah Lipstadt, who's the envoy on anti-Semitism czar, allowed that they added in that description that we're also, as a very important part of defining anti-Semitism, is the nexus definition, N-E-X-U-S. That was unbelievable. Nexus says, if you oppose Israel's right to exist, that's not anti-Semitism. That's not anti-Semitism, which is ridiculous. And yet, this administration, with the backing of Deborah Lipstadt, has allowed that to be in the description of anti-Semitism. I assure you, if you are against the Jewish state, you hate Jews. If you're against Italy's survival as a state, I assure you, you hate Italians. And the same goes for France and Spain. And yet, we have as part of our definition of anti-Semitism that you're allowed to say you oppose Israel's right to exist. It's not anti-Semitism.
Okay, let's get to questions from the audience. This person has been waving his hand. Please make a question.
I'm just wondering what your perspective is on the Abraham Accords. I've been worried ever since the peace with Jordan and the peace with Egypt that if the Arabs ever had a chance to coalesce against Israel, even if they had a peace treaty, they would throw that in the garbage and try and destroy Israel. And I think that I believe that the Abraham Accords are the same type of a thing. And I just was wondering what your perspective is.
Well, when the Abraham Accords were about to be issued, I got a call from David Friedman, the ambassador from the U.S. to Israel, pleading me not to condemn them because part of the Abraham Accords supports a Palestinian state. And of course, this will be a disaster to establish a Palestinian state. They begged me to say nothing, and I didn't, because my friend David Friedman begged me. He said, don't worry, I'm not establishing a state. We need to get that in there to get support in Congress for this. Bahrain and these countries, part of these accords, did not in any significant way condemn 10-7. They're not supporting Israel and destroying Hamas. So no, I have the same concerns as you, that the bottom line is they will revert back to Islam and their enmity to Jewish people. You know, I'm glad to see that they signed something, and they are doing significant business now with Israel, so that's a positive thing, and maybe their attitudes toward Jews will change with regard to this. But when push comes to shove, as 10-7 indicated, they weren't there condemning this and condemning Hamas. So that is a cause for the concern that you have. I have the same concerns.
Question here.
Thank you. I want to ask, you mentioned Hamas maybe 200 times tonight.
It was 350.
250 or 350. One time you didn't mention our hostages. One time you didn't mention 200 people that have to evacuate their house from the north and the south. And you still want us to go and wipe the Hamas.
So what is your question?
Excuse me?
What is your question?
Yeah. Why you didn't mention all this stuff? You sounds like you want to go to war in Hezbollah. In what is it?
That is correct.
Don't have better friend than Biden.
No. It's okay. It's okay.
First of all, this was a talk about the lies against Israel. Of course, my heart breaks for the Jews who have been kidnapped. I don't even like the phrase "bring them home." It's "let them go." Bring them home. It puts a responsibility on Israel to do something. It's their responsibility. They kidnapped them. They should be released. And of course, we talk about this when we're in Capitol Hill regularly. But when Biden has slow walked the arms Israel needs in this war, he's not giving them all the arms that they want in a timely manner. When he's demanded that they not go into Rafah, which is critical to destroy Hamas, when 2 days after 10/7, Blinken put a tweet out saying, "Do not retaliate." Is this a friend of Israel? Blinken said, "Do not retaliate against 10/7." When Iran launched several 100,000 missiles against Israel, Biden said, "Leave it alone. Don't retaliate in any single way." So, and almost every person he's appointed, look, I don't want to make this political, but these are facts. But almost every person, almost every person that Biden appointed that affects Israel is someone hostile to Israel and who's a friend of Obama. Almost every person he's appointed is a friend of Obama. So I respectfully disagree that this administration has been extremely hostile. He now gives the Palestinian Authority $800 million a year. He ignores the Taylor Force Act. He has ignored sanctions against Iran and let them become wealthy to fund Hamas and Hezbollah. How on earth, sir, can you say Biden has been good for Israel and the Jews, given these facts? It's shocking to me.
China given them about $10 billion
I'm sorry?
in the last 5 years. Isn't it China that's been giving them money for their oil from Iran? You forgot to mention that.
Look, I can mention many things. I spoke too long as it was. No, China is no friend. China is no. We gave. Well, that is correct. There's other countries.
I have a question as one of the youngest people in this room. Just because I think my voice, my generation, is really important in this conflict, and I am not represented in this room at all. So my question for you is, I think along with what I don't know too much love, but is that a lot of this, obviously we're all here because we support Israel, we support the Jews. But don't you think the more that we spread hate on either side and bring down BIPOC in general, and we can say that us as Jews are ethnicities as well, how do you think spewing more hate is going to lead to a better peace?
I don't know what you mean hate. I hate evil. We are required under Jewish law to hate evil. I hate Nazis. I hate Islamic radicals who say kill every Jew and destroy Israel. Yes, I hate them. And it is my obligation to hate them and fight them. I don't promote hatred against innocent, decent human beings. Never. I don't promote hate against...
I'd like to ask you.
I tell my wife not to have an opinion, okay? Please.
I'd like to ask you a question. I'd like to ask you a question about the hostages and why no one, why people aren't concerned about their treatment. And under every accord, the treatment of hostages is very important. And the treatment of the Israelis hostages has been abominable. And you don't hear any nation talking about it.
We've been fighting with the Red Cross to go in there and see what's going on with the hospital. They refused. The Red Cross refuses to go in there and do anything. And frankly, the world doesn't really care about the hostages because it's a bunch of Jews. And not only have been treated horribly, the majority of the 130 we think are still there are not alive. My sources in Israel tell me most of them, tragically, I hope and pray it's not true, that they're not alive. No, they've been treated horribly. And Israel believes the best way to get to release them is to crush Hamas and make their Hamas in fear of being destroyed, and then they'll do anything to save themselves. But unfortunately, their hands have been tied in part by this administration.
Our final question.
Understandably, you speak very passionately. You're sort of a person of one. For 40 years, I've said to Israel and Ron Drummer and Omer when they were here, and Michael, the ambassadors. Israel has had the worst PR. The best they could do would be to educate us with information and some facts. And I said, you're losing the young people. So that is a question to you. They're not saying that Egypt could have opened up 2 million the border, and if Israel allowed them to go back, and they could have cleaned out the whatever. But my real question is, I understand that Netanyahu gave millions and trillions and gazillions to Hamas, hoping that he could split everybody. It didn't work. And we didn't know where, with all the satellites, where is all the Earth going from all the tunnels? Nobody's talking about that. But my hope is that you can educate us with information with a little slight less passion so that you can bring people together on all sides.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, Israel's PR is terrible. And what do I blame? Who do I blame for the reason we have such terrible PR? I think the most important factor in bad PR is that the Israeli officials, the Jewish leaders, and the rabbis do not push back against the lie of occupation, Jerusalem's holy to Muslims, the Taylor Force Act that they pay Arabs to murder Jews. When I speak in college campuses, the kids never heard that they pay Arabs to murder Jews. And they called me a liar. I had to take out my cell phone and look up Taylor Force Act and read it to them. They're in shock. We do not tell the truth about this monstrous culture, and it is, there's exceptions. Look, I know all these people. I met with Dermer for 2 hours in the past year, begging him to publicly push back on these lies that the anti-Semites and the Arabs promote. And what does Ron Dermer tell me? It's not important. All that matters is that we enhance our high-tech industry, and the world will become knocking down our doors. I say the same to Bibi. He says to me, they'll accuse me of being against peace. Bibi made a terrible mistake. I went to Qatar. I met with the emir. He invited me. And I condemned him for funding Hamas. And he said to me, what do you want from my life? Netanyahu is begging me to fund it. I didn't believe it. I called Netanyahu when I got back. He said, yes. We think that keeps things quiet. Israel begged Qatar to fund Hamas. A horrible mistake. And why does Israel allow 200,000 serious rockets and missiles in Lebanon sit there without going in and destroying all of them? Well, they're in the midst of civilian areas. They got to make an announcement to the civilians in those areas, get the hell out, we're coming in, we're going to destroy those missiles. How does Hamas sit there with 100,000 rockets and we don't go in and destroy them? Because we're afraid we'll end up killing civilians. So I really blame Israel in not pushing back Jewish leaders. Look, as I said, every major Jewish organization right now supports a Palestinian state. My friend Alan Dershowitz, who I argue with all the time, supports a Palestinian state. And I say, Alan, do you support a Palestinian state being established this month? No, they're not ready. How about in 6 months? They're not ready. So you're against the Palestinian state. You're saying in some distant future, if they change, you support it. But we don't know if they'll ever change. So why aren't you saying, I oppose a Palestinian state, because this has become a terrorist regime. And he says, when I open up my speeches to college kids saying I support a state, I get them on my side more. I get them to see that I'm really, very liberal and very understanding and sympathetic.
Excuse me, in honor of the young person who had the guts to speak. 50 years ago.
Please sit. Please sit, Joni. Finish up, please.
AIPAC on their website supports the state. Dennis Ross just wrote an op-ed, he's the head of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Not only does he support a state, he wants Abbas to be the head of it. I mean, this is our people, our pro-Israel people. Ted Deutsch just wrote an op-ed supporting a Palestinian state. We should say, no state, you're a bunch of terrorists who pay people to murder us, you teach kids to hate us, and we don't want you to have more power by giving you a state. But people are afraid if you say that, they'll say, you're a warmonger, you're a hater, you're against peace. We have to start telling the truth. There's the truth of the Arab-Islamic war against Israel in the West. In order to start making policies that will start to make them realize that their actions will not be supported. They will get nothing. They will get nothing by promoting the agenda that they keep promoting. But when they see the whole world, the UN just passed a resolution overwhelmingly for a Palestinian state. Why? This is a terrorist regime. We're not doing the right thing by making the Palestinians understand they will get nothing by their actions. We keep saying, you're going to get more. I mean, they're saying, Palestinian state now, you want to reward Hamas for 10-7? The world wasn't even talking about a state until 10-7. So you're really encouraging this type of action. Hamas sees it works. You get the world to give you more and more.
Yeah, it's a passionate discussion. It's passionate because our people are being attacked and killed. And we have to respond. I appreciate your all coming, and especially a thank you to Morton. Thank you so much.